Latest business news, and of course budget has dominated the day. Devan Murugan joining me once more in studio. More reaction, Devan?
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's all about the economy, and whatever the finance minister puts on the table, the question is, does that ultimately bring in more investment, create more jobs? Well, Business Leadership South Africa has called it a solid budget. For more, I'm joined by Busisiwe Mavuso, the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa. Busi, thanks for joining us. I mean, let's start with perhaps SA's biggest challenge, right? The minister's response to the energy crisis, which is crippling your segment, I mean, big and small business. We knew that eNCA Godongwana would announce that debt takeover for Eskom and other forms of relief. But does this approach this afternoon look promising?
Devan, it definitely does. Good evening. It definitely does. I think we always knew that addressing the energy crisis was always going to be central to this budget. And the Eskom's debt relief of 254 billion is definitely larger than expected. Unfortunately, it actually means that the debt levels of the country are going to go up. But I think let's appreciate and let's accept that the Eskom debt transfer was always going to happen, and it is a necessary step to help address the crippling effects of load shedding. So the conditionality that has actually been put to it, I think, is quite something that the markets were actually watching closely and that they were expecting. Now, the trick is going to be, are we going to put interventions in place to ensure that these conditionalities are met? You know, what guardrails is government going to put in place and ensure that Eskom can actually ensure that they use the money to prioritize capital expenditure in transmission and distribution, as well as focus on the maintenance of generation fleet and improve electricity availability. Because it is now getting to a stage, Devan, where it is underwhelming when the government says it is going to do anything, because we talk about all these grand plans, we announce all these, brilliant initiatives, but then we don't follow through in terms of monitoring and evaluation. But I think overall, I think it's a highly positive move towards improving the much needed energy security and addressing the inadequate generation capacity. And I really think that the tax incentives that he has actually given, to business, to households, the bounce back loan scheme, it's quite refreshing. Businesses are doing this anyway, with or without government's assistance, but government providing tax incentives and tax measures is actually going to accelerate the process. And Devan, I really think that it has been cleverly done, because they're actually giving us a window, to say that try and do this within the short term, within the next 2 years for businesses and within the next year for households. It is another way of trying to actually get investment flowing, because we know that it is this investment that is actually going to ensure that our economy is growing at the right level.
I was going to ask you about that, if I can interject. Sorry, Busi. I mean, this time and this window period for taking advantage of those tax incentives for households, for example. I saw that as a negative initially, but you say there is some positive spin-offs of having a window period cut in a specified time.
The spin-off is precisely that, to say that where we are at the moment, when you're sitting with about 46% unemployment in terms of the expanded definition, you need to be seen to be creating jobs, Devan, as a government. You need to be providing a platform and an environment that will actually be conducive to creating jobs. Now, this window period is an opportunity. And remember, there is the investment conference that the president has spoken about that is actually coming in May. Is it in May or is it in April 2023, where he has actually set a target of 2 trillion rands. Now, the way he has actually couched, these tax incentives is actually saying to those investors that are trying to come into the country, to existing businesses, that if you were to actually give investment commitments that are focused on renewable energy, so not only is it getting the money, but it's actually making sure that the money is being spent where the country needs it the most. Yep. If you spend this money on IPPs or on renewables, then you actually get a reduction in your taxable income. And I really think that, as I'm saying, businesses are already trying to find ways of how to deal with the crippling effects of load shedding. So I think this really focuses their attention and really their plans. It accelerates, the plans that they actually had put in place. So it's definitely a positive. I think the only thing from a bounce back loan scheme that I would want to know is, can government ensure that the SMMEs that are designed to benefit from this can really access this? Because I worry, just like in COVID, Devan, you remember they introduced a similar scheme with billions of rands, but a lot of SMMEs were actually saying, we don't know how to actually access this money.
Access was a problem and criteria was a problem.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Let me get on to this here very quickly. I mean, a total of 14 billion rand allocated to fight crime and corruption, Busi. I mean, no doubt you've said this before, this is a taint in the South African economy, especially when it comes to investor sentiment. I'm wondering whether investors look at that and say, well, 14 billion rand to fight crime, that's an investor positive there. Do you see it that way?
It definitely is, because 1.3 billion of it, for instance, has actually been allocated to the National Prosecuting Authority to support the implementation of the recommendations of the State Capture Commission. So we couldn't have spent so many billions of rands on the State Capture Commission and not be seen to be putting and supporting through our budget and our resources, the NPA, to ensure that they can actually work with the reports that they got from Zondo to implement what needs to be implemented. So I think this is definitely a positive. One of the huge concerns of the international community is that we have had this crippling state capture, as a country where SOEs were actually hollowed out, but then there is very little that is actually being done or seen, to ensure that the criminals are brought to book. So government is saying we are going to put our mouth where our money is, or our money where our mouth is, and we're actually going to give the resources to the criminal justice system to do what it needs to do. So that is definitely a positive, and it is highly welcomed by the business community.
Yeah. There were bailouts, small bailouts this time around, but comparatively speaking, I think those numbers are smaller than we've seen in the past. South African Airways gets R1 billion, 2.5 billion rand to the South African Post Office. What's your take on that? I mean, money well spent, or do you question that?
I'm really hoping that this is actually going to be accompanied by the strict conditions that the minister has actually spoken about. I doubt it. They've given bailouts before and they've set strict conditions, and they are yet to come. So I think the bailouts in particular to SAA are a big disappointment. BLSA really despairs at the allocation to SAA as it adds to the billions, Devan, of rands that have already been wasted in trying to save the entity before it went to business rescue. And in the broader scheme of things, we've got more pressing issues. We've got more urgent matters where we should actually be spending the money. So we are disappointed that government is still trying to actually save SAA when it is not a strategic area for government to play in. What was important for us on the SOE bit was the rationalization and the large savings initiative that the minister spoke about, when he was talking about closing some of the state entities, because when you look at it really, in the 743 SOEs, Devan, there are a lot of duplications. There are a lot of areas where government is playing where they should not be playing. There is a lot of areas where government is providing services that are currently being provided by the private sector, and the private sector is doing a better job of it. So I really think that I'm hoping that that exercise will focus government on providing the services that only they as government can provide. And they must stay away from actually doing what the private sector is doing, because we don't have a capable state and we don't have efficiencies in the public sector.
Busisiwe, I'll let you go. I mean, it was quite interesting that the Treasury releases a growth forecast of 0.9% this year, given the electricity constraints on this economy. The Reserve Bank tells us not so long ago that this economy will grow by 0.3%. So all your calculations are done on that 0.9%. Why do you think the Treasury was a bit more optimistic, 3 times more optimistic, in fact, than the Reserve Bank?
I guess it's their job to be optimistic. And when you look at it, they always give forecasts that are higher than what we actually attain in the broader scheme of things. I wonder if they are not pricing in the mining tax windfalls that we've benefited from before, but it would actually be a mistake to actually price those in, Devan, because remember, the mining community has actually told us that because of the inefficiencies at Transnet, because of the fact that they've not been able to export as much as they would have liked to, they've actually lost billions of rands. So if government is actually hoping that those mining windfalls are still going to be continuing, then I think they made a mistake in thinking that that was going to be. But Treasury, I think, always gives us more optimistic forecast than what actually comes through at the end of the day.
Busisiwe Mavuso, the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa, thanks for your time this afternoon.